Hey guys, today we're going to do a video where we're going to look at a few CPUs, specifically the DX2 chips from a couple different manufacturers. Here I've got the Intel and the AMD. We're also going to take a quick, more of like an overview of the DX4 chips. But I wanted to do a comparison video or a CPU face-off video, and I kind of got the idea a while back. LGR, you guys probably all know who that is. He's sort of the undisputed, well, maybe not undisputed, but he's sort of the de facto king of retro computing on YouTube. Got a lot of videos, been doing it for a long time. He did a building a 46 video, and it was a competent machine. There's a couple things. His initial lack of L2 cache was a little bit strange, and the wood grain paneling, there's no excuse for that. But it was a good machine. But during his video, he kind of made an offhand remark about the AMD chips at the time being faster than the Intel chips. Now, my initial thought was he meant that like a 66 megahertz AMD chip was faster than the 66 megahertz Intel chip. That was my initial thought. After thinking and rewatching it, I think what he meant was that AMD made 46s that were faster than the Intel. Like, Intel stopped making 46 chips at 100 megahertz, whereas AMD made a 120 and a 133 megahertz 46. So maybe that's what he meant. It's a little unclear though. So maybe he did think that meant to say that the Intel or the AMD was faster than the Intel. Anyways, that's kind of irrelevant. But it did get me on this line of thinking that, you know, I've always supposed that these are clones. I don't know. They had AMD and Intel had a kind of a falling out in the 386 era. But from everything I know, these chips are so close in performance. I don't know if there was some AMD doing some reverse engineering to get their version of the chip. Cyrix's chip, I know, is a bit more of an independent design as far as I know. But there's a lot of talk out there about what has better. Some of these chips have floating point math. The Cyrix chip supposedly has better integer performance. So I just wanted to take a look at these chips, compare them, run some benchmarks, also, do some other stuff. I'll get into that in a minute, but that's why I'm doing this video. So let's take a look at the DX4 chips real quick, and then we'll come back to these DX2s. Now, I think a lot of this misunderstanding comes from certain things, which I'll explain here with the DX4 chips. So Intel and AMD both made DX4 chips, which were 100 megahertz. So what we need to understand first is write-through and write-back memory. And that has to do with the caches. Now, write-back memory is faster. It's also, I believe at the time, it was more expensive to implement. So it wasn't as common. And I believe your motherboard also had to support it. But just remember, write-back is the faster type. So with the DX4, the first one that came out was Intel's. Now, Intel's chip had 16 kilobytes of onboard L1 cache that was write through. Now, that's the more standard type. Then AMD came out with this chip here, and it only had 8 kilobytes of L1 cache that was also write through. So right off the bat, the Intel chip has double the L1 cache. So in certain applications and situations, this is going to be faster than the AMD chip. So that might be where some confusion comes in, but both companies made versions later that were write-back, that had write-back cache. So later on, Intel came out with the chip that had 16 kilobytes of L1 write-back cache. AMD did the same thing. They also came out with a later version that had 16 kilobytes of write-back cache. Now, theoretically, those two chips should be identical in performance. Now, I don't have these are both the write-through versions, the earlier ones, and I don't have the write-back versions to compare because they're a little bit pricey on eBay. They're going for like between 30 and 50 bucks. You might be able to find a good deal on them if you're lucky, but I don't have them. So it wouldn't really be fair to compare these two chips because the Intel ones they're not really the same leak because this one has double the L1 cache. But that could be where people get it mixed up. Maybe they have this Intel chip and then they put in an AMD chip that has the 16 kilobytes of write-back cache, and then it's going to be a little faster. And they're like, oh, well, the AMD chip is faster than the Intel. But that's not necessarily true, because you're not comparing the same, chips, really. Same speed, but different amounts of L1 cache. So for our little experiment today, we are going to be comparing these chips, which these are the DX2s, and these are the 66 megahertz chips. Now, these are exactly the same, technically speaking. These are both DX2s at 66 megahertz, and they both have 8 kilobytes of L1 cache right through cache. So, I mean, I still see arguments, and it's not just the 100 megahertz chips, it's also these DX2 chips that people will claim, oh, the AMD chip's faster, oh, the Intel's faster, or, one has better, floating point math than the other. I don't know about that. I mean, like I said, these are supposed to be pretty much exactly the same. And that's what I'm going to find. I'm going to run them through a battery of benchmarks. I'm going to do some benchmarks to try to get some numbers on the, the built-in math coprocessors to see if one's better than the other. My prediction is that these are going to be the same speed, or they're going to be so close, it's going to be within the margin of error. That is just my prediction. I'm also going to I'm going to install OS2, and I'm going to see if it works, if there is that compatibility problem. Now, I don't know the specific version. I have OS2 Warp version 3, so we'll see if it runs on the Intel, but not on the AMD chip. So that's a face-off here. And just to mix things up, I'm also adding in 2 other chips. First off, I'm going to bench this too. Now, this is also an Intel DX2 chip, but this probably can't see because the light's not all that great, but this is actually the enhanced DX2. This is the SX955, so this has the write-back cache. Same amount, 8 kilobytes of L1 write-back cache on it. So this should be faster than either of these two. But remember, AMD also made an enhanced DX2 chip with write-back cache. So if you have 2 of the write-back cache chips together, they should probably be the same speed too. Now here's one that interests me. This is a Cyrix DX2 at 66 megahertz. Now this chip I don't know about, because apparently the Cyrix chip is independently engineered. It's not really a clone. So it might perform a little differently. I don't know if it will be faster or slower or the same. I really don't know. But I'm curious to find out. I don't think the difference is going to be huge either way. But I am a little curious. So those 2 chips are extras to check that out here. Alright, so here's the motherboard I'll be doing these benchmarks with. This is a GA46VF motherboard here. I don't know why it's specifically marked Intel DX4 CPU 100. Actually, this came with the AMD CPU 100 on it, but I've got 256K of L2 cache. Actually not sure, I don't remember the memory on there, but yeah, this is the motherboard we'll be using. It has VLB slots. It supports higher end 46 chips, so this board should work just fine. For the video card, I'm just using this. This is a Cirrus Logic VLB card. It's a CLGD5426. So this is what I'm going to be using for video, and I'm just going to be using kind of a generic Winbond VLB I/O controller. I won't be installing a sound card at this point because it's not really relevant to the benchmarks. So let's put this thing together and find out how it goes. Let's get a better view of this motherboard there. It's got a CIS chipset. I like that little mini barrel battery there. It's tiny. Alright, so let's see how this goes. We'll get those bench results. Alright, so first up is our AMD DX2. And if you look up here with CPU identification, 67.2 megahertz within running L1 cache, enabled write-through mode. Alright. Alright, and now it is the Intel's turn. Oh, by the way, I ditched the VLB-IO controller. It wasn't detecting the hard drive I wanted to use, so just used a simple ISA one. It really shouldn't make too much of a difference. Alright, so here we go. You can see this is the Intel. A lot more information from it. Same thing, same amount of cache, same speed and everything. So let's see how it stacks up at the bench. Alright, the results from our main two contenders, the Intel and AMD, are in, but I'm not going to reveal them till we do the other test. So next up is the Cyrix 66 MHz DX2 with the stylish green heatsink built onto it. And here we go with it. Now, it's clocking in, the other ones were clocking in at 67 MHz, but this is a 66.6, so again, same amount of write through L1 cache. So I'm interested to see how this one's going to stack up to the others. Alright, and last but not least, our write back enhanced Intel DX66, just to see how much of a boost we get from that write back cache. And as you can see, this motherboard, fairly newer BIOS, and it supports external and internal write back and write through. So I'm just going to turn the internal cache to write back since the enhanced chip supports it. Alright, well there's the chip. Now interestingly, with cache CPU identification, it is coming up as a write back enhanced chip, same speed as the others, but when we look down here on the internal L1 cache, it says enabled in write through mode, not write back mode. And I don't know, maybe that's just another quirk where it's another one of those things where it says it will do it in BIOS, but it doesn't. So we'll just run the benchmarks. If they come up the same, just assume it didn't enable the write back mode, and we'll just disqualify the results of this chip. Okay, I found the problem. Other than setting it in the BIOS, there's also a jumper that has to be set. So now we are in write back mode for the 66 MHz Intel enhanced chip. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, the results from all the benchmarks are in. Before we start though, and I announce the winner, we have to disqualify the write back cache Intel DX2. I don't know what was going on there, but in most of the benchmarks it scored exactly the same as its write through cache brother here. In some tests it actually scored a good bit lower. So I don't know what's going on there, because it's doing exactly the opposite of what is supposed to happen with write back cache. It's supposed to be faster, but it's actually degrading the performance a little bit. So I have no idea what's going on there. Maybe it's some weird setting on the motherboard, I do not know. So I have to disqualify this chip. Alright, so the winner is, well, it's a tie. The results are pretty much exactly what I thought they would be. These two chips, the AMD and the Intel chip, DX2 66 MHz, are pretty much exactly the same performance-wise. Actually, I had slightly better results with the Intel chip, but I mean slightly, like, you know, less than 1 frame rate or FPS. It's all really within a margin of error. These two chips perform exactly the same. Weird mixed results with the Cyrix chip. In general, it did a little bit worse than these, but there was a couple benchmarks where it did better, but not like stunningly better for the most part. So let's look at those numbers here. Alright, here we go. Here's the little handy dandy graph I put together using it's like a free graph pie chart making utility on the web. I always use it. It's free, why not? And I like charts. So as you can see here right off the bat, the Intel and the AMD DX2-66 MHz are virtually identical as far as performance goes. And then we have the Cyrix down at the bottom, which is still very, very close. I mean, it's a little bit interesting because it varies. You know, it's a little slower in most areas, but this performance of all three of these chips is, I'm not even sure it would be really, you know, perceivable on a system. But let's start with 3D Bench. Again, the Intel AMD scored exactly the same on these benchmarks, and I ran the benchmarks several times over. And yeah, they're exactly the same. The Cyrix is a little bit behind by a couple frames, not much. I think it's like like 3 frames, big deal. PCP Bench, same story. The Intel chip is ahead by 0.1 FPS. Interesting here, the Cyrix chip is like ahead by 0.2, 0.2 ahead of the AMD, and well, 0.3 ahead of the AMD, and I think 0.2 ahead of the Intel chip there. Just quickly looking here, it's less than 1 FPS, virtually the same. Next we get into some real games. We got Doom. Again, the Intel and the AMD chip, less than 1 FPS difference. The Cyrix chip seems to fall behind a bit here by a couple FPS. Again, nothing ground shattering. Yeah, maybe like 3 or 4 FPS behind. Noticeable, I think, but nothing huge. And lastly, Quake. Again, the Intel and AMD chips, 0.1 FPS difference between them. Virtually identical, well within the margin of error. They're performance-wise, they're identical performance-wise, basically. Cyrix chip again falling behind by like 1 FPS around. Not a big deal. SpeedSys, I don't know how SpeedSys calculates things. Sometimes it's a little bit weird. I just ran it because it was on the hard drive. As we can see again, even with SpeedSys, the Intel and AMD chips virtually identical. You know, less than 1 point difference between them. Oddly enough, the Cyrix chip, despite falling behind in you know, 3 of the 4 other tests, SpeedSys seems to give it a little bit of a advantage over the Intel and AMD. I don't know if it's figuring in other things there. Remember, all 3 chips run on the same system with the same parts. All I did is pop out one chip and put in another. So yeah, I don't know why SpeedSys, how it's figuring things out, but yeah. So I mean, overall, I would put, just looking at these numbers, the Cyrix chip, it works just fine. If that's all you got, put it in. You're probably not really going to notice too much of a difference. But it may be slightly noticeably slower than the others. I mean, like maybe barely perceivably, depending on the program. This is only like 4 benchmarks out of potentially hundreds and hundreds of games and programs. But looking at these numbers, yeah, there's no difference performance-wise between the Intel and the AMD DX2. Just there's none. So now we're going to do the little compatibility test. I want to see, I'm going to run OS2, and I'm going to see if supposedly the AMD is going to fail with that, where the Intel chip will not, but we're going to find out. Alright, and now on to the OS2 part of our experiment here. This box says version 3, but really what's in there is OS2 Warp version 4. So we go over, and as you can see, it is the Intel 66 MHz DX2, and it loaded up OS2 Warp just pretty okay. There's that weird graphical distortion right there, but yeah, it's running OS2 Warp just fine. So I'm gonna just shut it down, pop that out, put in the AMD chip, and we'll see if it loads it up just fine, just like the Intel chip. So interestingly enough, it seems that the AMD 66 MHz chip possibly died at some point, because when I inserted it and tried to run it, the system would not post. So instead I put in that 100 MHz DX4 AMD chip, which is basically the same thing, except instead of clock doubled, it's clock tripled. So that's what I've got in there now. And it booted up. but I'm getting a lot more instability. Like, well, obviously you could see the graphics are all messed up. Although honestly, that couldn't be the video card rather than the CPU, since it was doing that a little bit with the Intel processor as well. So, I mean, if it works with the 100 megahertz, the DX4, it probably would work with the DX2 as well. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not true that OS2 won't work on the AMDs, but, I mean, this is version 4, Warp version 4, so could be that it's an earlier version that has the incompatibility. So, yeah. Okay, and finally, now this is interesting, the Cyrix DX2-66 megahertz does seem to have hit a problem with OS2. Some sort of error. So that is very interesting. That's what I was kind of expecting with the AMD chip from what people have told me. But like I said, it looks like it's popped up here with the Cyrix. So it does look like there may be some sort of compatibility issue with Cyrix chips in OS2. Like I said, maybe. I'm not 100% sure. This has been a consistent error with this chip, so I mean, that's what it looks like from this end. Alright, so the testing's been done. What are my conclusions? What do I think? Well, first of all, between these three chips, I mean, all three of them are fairly identical. Regardless of what system it is, I have a hard time believing anyone would, you know, if played on a system, they'd be able to say, like, oh, that must be the Cyrix chip because it's running slower or something. They're all very close. I guess the least desirable of these, despite the cool green heatsink, would be the Cyrix chip. A lot of the benchmarks, it came up a little bit short compared to these two. Not by much, but by a little bit. There may be some programs that it actually runs better than these. I don't know. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of games and programs out there. I only benchmarked a few, so you never know. Like I said, there could be things that this chip runs better with than these two, but overall it just seemed to be a little bit slower. Maybe not even very, like, perceivably slower, but it is a little bit slower. And we had that incompatibility problem I found with OS2. I actually took this out and popped in my Intel, the 100 megahertz Intel, and OS2 booted right up. So it does seem to be something with this chip. So between these three, I definitely wouldn't go with the Cyrix if you had the choice. Now between these two, they're virtually identical. I mean, performance seemed to be a pinch, and I mean a pinch higher with the Intel chip, but it's within margin of error. It's negligible. These two chips, as far as I can tell, are pretty much identical. So, you know, when someone's telling you, oh, this chip does this better, or this, you know, this DX2, the AMD, or the Intel, they're probably just kind of full of it, because these pretty much seem identical. Now, like I said, there's hundreds and hundreds of programs. Maybe there's one or two where one works out better than the other. I doubt it. They seem pretty much identical. The AMD chip, it wasn't this one, because this one seems to have died for whatever reason, but the AMD 100 megahertz, which is pretty much just this, that's clock tripled instead of doubled, it booted up OS2 fine. That doesn't mean that, you know, the AMD chip might not, I mean, you know, depending on setup, or maybe an older version of OS2 that whoever was talking about had a problem. Maybe it wouldn't work with an older version, but for OS2 Warp version 4, it worked just as well as the Intel chip. So, I mean, if I was forced to pick, I'd just pick the Intel, just because, you know, it's Intel and it's the standard, but I wouldn't complain with either of these. They're pretty much identical. Now, as far as the 100 megahertz versions, not really the point of this video, but I'll just briefly talk about it. Really, if I was going that fast, I'd just go with the AMD 5X86, or even the Cyrix 5X86 100 megahertz, because those can be, at least the IBM one's overclocked to 120 pretty well, and they're not a 486 anymore. They really are a 586 chip. and they perform pretty well. And the AMD 5x86 is just, you know, like a crazy cool chip, and it overclocks really well. I've overclocked that thing to 160 megahertz with no problems. If you were forced to pick between a 100 megahertz chip between AMD and Intel, I'd probably just go with Intel because it's kind of like the safe bet, and they all have 16 kilobytes of L1 cache, whereas most of the AMD ones only have 8 kilobytes of L1 cache. But I mean, I don't have the 16 kilobyte write-back cache version of Intel or AMD, but I would assume those two chips are identical. So, I mean, that's pretty much the conclusions of my findings. If you have your own findings that differ, or, you know, any information, feel free to add it in comments. I don't get offended if, you know, you have an opposite view or something, as long as you present it to me in a, you know, reasonable fashion and you aren't a jerk about how you say it. You know, I'm open to do more tests or whatever, and read your comments and information. So thanks for watching the video. Have a good one.